Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We are continuing our Muslim Changemakers talk today through our World Hijab Day organization. And today I'm your host, Ashley Pierce Khan. Today we're talking about changemakers in STEM, and I am joined by Safiyyah Sabreen. She is a researcher and medical engineer from Kashmir. She has a master's in philosophy and is currently studying Arabic grammar. She is the content director for No, a UK-based education tech company that's focused on reviving the culture of education and lifelong learning for Muslims. She also directs the Second Golden Age series, a project that highlights how Muslims created the world's first ever international scientific revolution inspired by the Quran and how today we can revive that legacy. Being interested in the field of Islam and science, she has she created a documentary in collaboration with a UAE-based media house on the Islamic Golden Age and how it changed the course of history. So she produces online courses and writes on Islam and science. I'm going to add her now. Here she is joining me in a field I have a lot of knowledge in, so I'm really excited to hear what you've got to say. So tell me, how would you describe the period of Islamic history called the Islamic Golden Age?
So this word, this sort of designation, the Islamic Golden Age, is essentially a relatively new one. European scholars, when they studied Islamic history and the period of Islamic history, especially the main period from the 9th century till the 13th century, when they found the existence of a lot of science, philosophy, technology, because at that time, so we're talking about 19th century Europe, science was at the pinnacle, just as it is right now. When they viewed science from their own perspective, European Orientalist scholars considered and they named this period to be the Golden Age of Islam. So the Golden Age of the Islamic civilization, where there was science, technology, a lot of learning, and a lot of progress, as we understand progress to be from their perspective. But from a Muslim's perspective, I would say there's a lot more that we can add to it, and it needs a redefinition. So usually what I do is I define this period, this entire period, not to be like the Islamic Golden Age. The proper word for me, if you would ask me, would be the Islamic intellectual ages, or the Islamic intellectual revolution, as we could call it. Or even if we really want to be very specific and talk about physical sciences, we would even call it the Islamic Scientific Revolution. So this is a scientific revolution before the European Scientific Revolution. Where does it start from? When does it end, if it does? It starts from, actually, if you really want to talk about the intellectual growth of Muslims, it starts from the Prophet ﷺ, right from his period when he started educating. That's the revolution in Medina, where he's educating people. He's giving them a methodology to question norms, to have objectivity in thought, and then to understand the created world as a manifest sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are like the building blocks of a much later revolution, whether it be in science, in other fields, philosophy, even religion, literature, culture, art. So if you would ask me how would I define this period of the Islamic Golden Age, it's a revolution, no doubt. It's intellectual because it's based on an appraisal of everything, be it culture, be it science, be it the universe, based on how the human intellect sees it. And also it is Islamic because it's based on, it has Tawheed and Islam, the central pillars of Islam as its core foundation. So it's the Islamic intellectual revolution, we would call it.
I like that. I like that you changed that wording a bit. So I'd like to dive into talking about some of the figures from this time. So can you name three important figures from the Islamic Scientific Revolution who changed the course of history?
I mean, the figures that I'm going to mention, what makes them important, even though there are thousands, literally, so many people that one can actually speak about, and it's not really, when you talk about science, let's say science in our world today, you cannot just say it's one figure or two figure. There are thousands of men and women together who built this enterprise. But where we do have the the pillars, the big pillars that hold up this entire huge enterprise, the scientific enterprise. And from our perspective, when you talk about modern science, it would be Einstein, it would be somebody like Niels Bohr, Charles Darwin, or some other people like that. But then when we talk about the Islamic revolution, the Islamic Scientific Revolution, I'm going to mention like three people who not only added to the building of science and to the building of particular disciplines of science, but they also added much to the perception of science, the methodology of science, and the popularization of science. So science essentially is built upon, or you would say science can only function by means of a methodology. You have to know what science is, how science works, and how it's different from literature, let's say, or philosophy, or art, or poetry. And this distinction obviously started way back before Islam, in the Greek civilization, even in the Chinese and the Indian civilization. But there's a difference between how the Greeks understood science and how we understand science. Huge differences in our perspectives of science. Their perspective was based on very rigid views on how what should be taken as knowledge, or what can be taken as true knowledge. And they considered a particular type of reasoning to be basically demonstrative, and a particular type of reasoning not to be demonstrative. But then when sort of think about what they had to say, you basically make a comparison between what the Greeks said and what science that we have right now, how does it function. There's like a big gap which historians of science and philosophers of science discuss, that this big gap was filled by Muslim scientists and Muslim philosophers. What's interesting to note, and many people, we actually miss that in today's scientific circles, is that Muslim scientists were also philosophers and were also religious scholars for the most part. So their worldview was very rich as compared to how we conduct science today, wherein a scientist is just very specifically working on a particular discipline. So this big gap that I'm talking about, this big leap from philosophy, literally, from deductive reasoning, it's called, to hardcore science, to inductive science, to experimentation, which is like, for example, experimentation is the holy grail of science. If you don't have experimentation, you can call it anything but science. This idea of emphasis on experimentation, emphasis on observation, emphasis on a particular type of reasoning, which is called inductive reasoning, all of these we see in the Islamic civilization. Like Muslim scientists were the pioneers, or you could say even, they popularized them. They educated people on the importance of these methods when it comes to studying science. So I'm going to mention a few of them. I'm going to go in a chronological order when it comes to these people. So you start with Al-Kindi, somebody like Al-Kindi. So he's called the first Arab philosopher because he is primarily, he's from the early period. He's a theologian, So he's from the Mu'tazilite theologians. They were the first people who wanted to bring in basically philosophy and religion, to reconcile philosophy and religion. And their core argument was, obviously, they had a lot of issues with their methodologies, and we as Sunni Muslims don't really go along with them because then they went extreme. But their core this idea was that Islam and the Quran is for people of intellect, and it invites people of intellect to ponder on the physical universe, and that means the place of the intellect is very central to the study of religion, and thus insofar as philosophy is all about the human intellect and reasoning, it should be reconciled very easily with religion. So he was the first one who reconciled Greek philosophy, who wanted to reconcile Greek philosophy with Islam. There are other things that he did as well. He's credited with inventing cryptography, and we use that, like for example, you use WhatsApp, and we get this message end-to-end encryption. So that's sort of a code conversion. Your conversation is converted to a particular code, which cannot be recognized even by the WhatsApp, people, and it's just between you and the sender. That's what they say. Now, this encryption, this coding, taking some piece of text and then turning it into a code, and a particular type of code, this was actually built, it was done by Kindi. He used something known as frequency analysis, and it's said that he used the Quran as his inspiration for this invention of cryptography, because the Quran uses particular words at a particular frequency. So anyways, it's a very well-known technology. It's still used in communication, especially military purposes, and other secret communication uses these cryptographic methods. But he added, one of his most important achievements is that he said that the philosophers the prophets, the religious people, the prophets have been given a kind of a knowledge about the universe, about the primary substances, he calls, like basically whatever exists in the universe, the truth about the universe. They've been given this knowledge by God. But then the ordinary people don't have access to that. So in order to get a taste of very fruitful religious experience, we need to follow the path of knowledge, which is the path of understanding nature. Now, the prophets get it instantaneously. We would get it over time and after a lot of effort, but then the study of the universe would give us a taste of what they get, which is a religious experience. This idea of experiencing divine unity, of experiencing Islam, basically. So we move from Al-Kindi, whose brilliant contributions to the making of science include obviously the scientific method, which is the basis of all of science today. Actually, before that, I would mention there was another figure, very early Muslim history, which is Jabir bin Hayyan. Now, after Al-Kindi, I'm going to be discussing Jabir bin Hayyan. Now, Jabir bin Hayyan has been credited with being the father of experimental chemistry. Now, you could say, we're living in very interesting times, and much of our economy is based on petrol, on oil, right? So, oil is the way it's available, and that's the way Allah has made the universe and the earth. Oil is available in a very crude form within the earth's deeper layers, and then it's actually crude oil is of very little use. It's only when it goes through a process of distillation that it can be put to use in our cars, to power our industries, to light up our houses. So this process of distillation is credited Jabir bin Hayyan is credited with this process of distillation. He's the one who perfected it. He's the one who created the apparatus for it, and he's then apart from these achievements, again he adds little more to the scientific method. So all along, these people, they are creating science, but then they're not just creating science, inventing this and inventing that. They're actually refining the method for future generations to work on that. So he insists that, and this is a quote that is attributed to him, that for you to actually develop chemistry, you have to conduct experiments. And somebody who doesn't conduct experiments will have no benefit from the study. So this emphasis on experimentation is what defines the Islamic Golden Age. And interesting parts about his life is that he's very interesting. He's a mystic. He's a Sufi. He's the student of Imam Jafar as-Sadiq. Imam Jafar as-Sadiq was the great grandson of the Prophet ﷺ. So he's from the Ahl al-Bayt. So he says, and not much is known about the knowledge of Imam Jafar as-Sadiq regarding chemistry, but only through Jabir bin Hayyan we come to know that even Imam Jafar as-Sadiq had knowledge about chemistry. So what that tells us is that this scientific revolution that we're talking about actually started very, very early on. This is 2 generations after the Prophet ﷺ. And there are these people who are so brilliant and who are studying earlier texts. They are critiquing earlier texts, because from Jabir bin Hayyan's work we come to know that Imam Jafar as-Sadiq was a critic of Greek conceptions of alchemy. They used to call it alchemy, as in this idea that the universe is just 4 elements. The world is just created out of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, from these historical texts, we know that he critiqued this idea. So it's very interesting to know that early on you have thinkers who are building original science. That's their creativity at place. So then we talked about Jabir bin Hayyan, and the third one I really want to take you through Ibn al-Haytham. Again, a towering figure, a polymath. By the way, all of these people are like great polymaths. They're just, it's not, nowadays you're a medical doctor, that's what you are. You're an engineer, that's what you are. That's because we specialize in a particular field. But in the Islamic intellectual revolution, you had people who were medical doctors, and then they were jurists, they were Islamic scholars, and then they wrote on mathematics, they wrote on physics, all of this together. So something like this is Ibn al-Haytham. He's just everywhere. He wrote on mathematics, he developed calculus. We know that Isaac Newton is famous for calculus, but it was Ibn al-Haytham who laid down the foundations of calculus, which is a particular technique in mathematics, very important. You wouldn't have much of your technology, much of your science, if it were not for these inventions in mathematics. And then his main achievement, apart from being he's been called the first true scientist, and why that is so is because firstly he emphasized on the scientific method, the golden rule of how to conduct science, and apart from that, he is the one who influenced the great thinkers, famous thinkers of Europe. So basically, the ones who brought about the European scientific revolution, people like Roger Bacon or Francis Bacon, and Galileo, Kepler. Uh, Especially from Roger Bacon's writing, we can see that he was very much inspired by Ibn al-Haytham. And why, which areas did he find inspiration from? That happens to be Ibn al-Haytham's expertise, which is the study of light. Now, for those of you who are interested in the history of science, we know that we had a brilliant revolution in science. Again, like science has these sort of phases where it just goes up. So last century was the quantum revolution, it's called. What was that? That was a revolution in light, in the understanding of light. And what happens is, even with Ibn al-Haytham, we see the same revolution taking place. A revolution in the understanding of light. So he basically conducts experiments to show how light moves in straight lines, which for that time is like remarkable to understand that nature of light. How light, the speed of light has to be something which is finite. He talks about that. And then he also now that forms a basis of physics. But then he also talks about how light is perceived by the eyes. So that is physiology, right? So he combines all of this, how light works in the outside world and how we perceive it. And then he goes against, how a huge number of literature that has been written on, especially from the Greek world, that has been written on the mechanics, on the dynamics of light. So the Greek philosophers, what they would, what they believed is that light basically is like a light bulb. So your eyes basically throw out light onto the world, and that's how they illuminate the world, and that's how you see stuff. So this was the Greek theory on light. But Ibn al-Haytham, now again, I want to emphasize, it was because of his emphasis on experimentation that he conducted. He made this dark room experiment where he showed that this is how light conducts itself, that this is how it works. And the way we perceive light is not that we are illuminating the world through our eyes. It is, in fact, that light enters our eyes. So it bounces off objects and it enters our eyes and it forms an image, just like an image is formed in a dark room. A similar mechanism happens inside our eyes, and the image is formed within our brain. So I want you to appreciate, this is like 1,000 years back. There are people who are like way ahead of their time, saying things that are absolutely like, these are fundamentals in physiology, in physics, in chemistry, and this is what made the basis of our world, our understanding of our world today.
It's so fascinating, just everything that you were talking about. You're so knowledgeable in it, mashallah. We don't really always think of where things came from and who thought of them, especially like something like encryption, which we pretty much kind of use every day. I mean, I use WhatsApp every day, so, I never thought of where that comes from. And now I think every time I see that, I'll think, oh, hey, a Muslim did that. So that's really cool. So you talked a little bit about some people in the past. So where does the Muslim world stand in science now? Can you name some important contemporary scientists who are making a difference?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I would, we're living in very interesting times actually, that we have thinkers within our circles who are sort of replicating, they're resurrecting the spirit of the golden age of the Islamic intellectual revolution. So just to remind you, this particular attitude towards learning that existed in the Islamic golden age, what was that? That attitude was basically all about how religion and science are not really, at odds with each other, and that And that the primary reason for that is because of the unity of knowledge. The unity of knowledge means that the physical world and the Quran actually come from the same source. So essentially there should be an inherent unity between these two. The author of the Quran, the one who sent down the Quran, is the one who created the universe. So what that means is a study of the universe, a deep, true analysis of the universe should lead me closer to my creator, just the way a study of the Quran leads us close to our creator. So this was like a very dominant view of the Islamic intellectual revolution, Islamic scientific revolution. All throughout, you find it throughout, all across the board, all scientists had this perception. And obviously, I mean, it's obvious because it was a religious culture, it was the actual intellectual milieu in which these people functioned in, that was Islam. So you would really, expect that. But now we're not in that phase. Now things have been secularized, education has been secularized, science has been overly secularized. So, but you still find scholars who are sort of, getting that spirit back, reviving that spirit, alhamdulillah. And so I want to talk about two of my favorite. There are many. Obviously, maybe, it requires a lot of time to go through all of those amazing research that is happening in the Muslim world by Muslims. But I want to talk about these two because in their works, you can see the same old, the same brilliant reconciliation between religion and science, and their rigorous scientific research. They're actually talking about the main issues about regarding their particular fields, but then they're using Muslim achievements from the past, the Islamic worldview and the Islamic theories on nature, on causality. Causality means the cause and effect. So basically, how did early Muslims view these issues? So they're digging out these theories and they're actually showing how they're still applicable. And what that does is that gives you a sense of, we're not really, it's not to call Islam pre-modern or even to think that it belongs to the ancient world is so far from the truth. Because all of the things that still are considered important for science, for philosophy, for this domain of religion and science were discussed in the Islamic world, and they're still applicable. They're still relevant. So I want to talk about somebody who I take as a great inspiration. This is a book by Dr. Mohamed Haj Yousef. So what this book is all about, he actually wrote like 3 volumes on this. He's a physicist. So Dr. Mohamed Haj Yousef is a physicist from the UAE, and he works in the field of quantum physics. But what he's done is that he's an expert also on Ibn Arabi, Sheikh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi, who is a great mystic, the great scholar from Spain, Muslim Spain, and he takes his theories about, now Sheikh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi wrote extensively about Islamic cosmology and about time. And he wrote about basically the nature of the universe, but in his own style. So Ibn Arabi was not a scientist, he was a mystic, but he was deriving his knowledge through a different route. Now a scientist derives knowledge through the route of the physical world. So you conduct experiments, you use logical reasoning, you use mathematics, and that's how you derive your conclusions. Whereas what mystics do, and this is well recognized within the Islamic intellectual arena, is that mystical knowledge is far ahead of time. So what you would have with physical means, a mystic would have like 1,000 years ahead of you. But where do they get that knowledge from? That is directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is Al-Haq, who is the truth. So if you want to know the true nature of, let's say, light, you want to know the true nature of the universe. What is the universe created out of? Is the universe made out of tiny fundamental blocks of matter, of spirit, of whatever it is? Or is it just homogeneous? Is it just, the same everywhere? It doesn't really break down into discrete stuff. So these are like big questions that people ask in science, in philosophy, throughout history. And then you have an answer from the scientists, and you have also an answer from the mystics. So Sheikh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi had a very, very interesting theory on time. How time is, really like you have atoms of matter, you have atoms of stuff, you also have atoms of time. And then he talked about how time is cyclic. It goes around in circles. It's a very complex, concept. And then he had his concepts about cosmology. One of the most important, one of the most fascinating ideas that he developed, and it was developed prior to him by theologians, is that the universe around, including yourself, everything, comes into existence in a moment, and the next moment it's gone. And then it comes into existence in a moment, and then it's gone. And basically what we are, what existence is just successive, coming into existence, going out of existence. Because it cannot stay without the command of Allah. So this is called continuous recreation, this theory. Now Ibn Arabi developed that, he brought, different things out of this same concept, and that's his field. He's famous for that. So I want to talk about Dr. Mohamed Haj, Yousef, the one who's written this book, brilliant book, and like two more like this. I'm showing you this one, where he talks about Ibn Arabi's theory of time, and what he does, which is so interesting, it's so amazing that actually we are living in a time where we could actually do that, is he takes these ideas, he converts them into mathematical formulae, and then he uses them in quantum physics. Now, for those of you who don't know, we have one of the biggest conundrums and paradoxes today in the world, which is, how do you reconcile quantum physics, which is the theory of the tiny stuff, with general relativity, which is the theory of the very large stuff, planets and galaxies and the universe. So they aren't reconciled, and this is like driving scientists almost like crazy. It's everywhere in the world you have like so many papers being written about the issues, about the possibilities of how to reconcile it, is it even reconcilable, or all of that. But alhamdulillah, it's very interesting that I find that Dr. Mohamed Haj Yousef actually takes all of those paradoxes, they call the unsolved mysteries of physics, and then he uses these formulae that he's derived from Ibn Arabi's cosmology and his conception of time being atomic, being quantized, and all of that converted into mathematics, and he actually produces solutions to those problems. He actually proves pretty, it's just amazingly how he proves that much of these problems and these paradoxes, like for example, for the audience who would be aware, there's this very important, it's a very amazing paradox, it's called the EPR paradox, and Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen paradox. What that is all about is basically, we know in today's world, that in today's science, that an action cannot, any action in the universe cannot function faster than the speed of light. The speed of light is the ultimate. You cannot go above the speed of light. That's the ultimate speed limit in the universe. But then the paradox, this EPR paradox, actually shows that for quantum physics to be accepted as, you know, a theory, a workable theory. And by the way, quantum physics is what makes your phone run, what makes our computers, the chips in our computers run, what makes the internet work. And almost it's argued that 1/3 or even more of the economy runs on quantum physics. So it's like a very successful theory, but then it has all of these issues, all of these paradoxes, and one of which is the EPR paradox. But then Dr. Mohamed Haj Yousef's work shows that if you take the idea of quantized time meaning time is made up of really tiny atoms, not the second, really smaller than the second, you would be able to resolve this paradox. Or, he says, in another book, he says, if you could, basically this idea of the continuous recreation that we just discussed, how the Muslim theologians developed this theory, and then Sheikh al-Akbar ibn Arabi actually developed it even further. He contextualized it. He really worked on it. If you could take that theory, that worldview, how the universe is being continuously recreated, and you sort of obviously give it a mathematical figure, you would be able to resolve this along with other paradoxes. So I think that is almost like groundbreaking, trailblazing work being done by Muslim scientists, not only reconciling religion with science, but also making it relevant. Like for most of us, we don't really understand much of mystical texts from the Islamic world. But then when you have something like this, you're like, oh my goodness, like somebody who was like 800 years back is saying things that we know now. Like for example, in the book he discusses how Ibn Arabi, Sheikh al-Akbar, he actually, much of his insights about the universe have been confirmed now. Now, obviously those are mystical insights, so he uses mystical language. Like he says, for example, during his time, what was orthodoxy, scientific orthodoxy, was that the stars are fixed. They don't move. They're just there, like light bulbs in the sky. Sheikh al-Akbar ibn Arabi doesn't, he doesn't agree with that, and he goes against the scientific orthodoxy of his time. Then other things, he actually talks about the speed of light in his works, and many other things that you're just amazed. So this is one work that I highly recommend for people who really want to understand the pioneering research that is being done in the Muslim world, which is not only reconciling religion and science, but actually producing great solutions to problems that we still consider unsolved. And another one which I feel, again, now this is because, well, I'm an engineer, so I'm more interested in physics, is Dr. Basil Altaei, again from the Middle East. He's written this brilliant book wherein now he talks about the Kalam conception. Now, what are the Kalam conceptions? The theologians from the Islamic history, so way before Ibn Arabi, so we're talking about just 100, 200 years after the Prophet ﷺ, there was this movement of Islamic theology. So these were people who constructed like very fantastic texts on how to understand the attributes of God, how to understand how God interacts with the world, and all of that. And then they went into physics, what we understand as physics. So these mutakallimun, they came up with theories about the universe, about how cause and effect works. And so what Dr. Basil Altaei basically discusses, he discusses many things, but one important thing that he discusses, which is again related to quantum physics, modern quantum physics. Remember, these are things that are powering your internet, your technology. This is not some distant technology. It's here, right around us. But it has all of these mysteries that shroud it. So one of the mysteries of quantum physics is that the way it defines the world, the universe, is in very probabilistic, uncertain terms. What that means is that an atom, let's say, or like for example, if I throw a ball up, obviously we all know it will go up and then it'll stop, it'll come back. Now, if you replicate the same action in the quantum world, the results that we get are that the same action, there is probability that it may not come down. Basically, it'll defy the laws that we know. So it'll behave in very uncertain ways. And that's built in the science that the universe at the fundamental quantum level behaves in very uncertain ways. And so there's always this probability of what can happen, what must happen, what eventually will happen. But then Dr. Basil Altaei asks the question that, okay, so if this is how the universe works, of what can happen, and there are other philosophers also who've asked this question, but then he asks it in the Islamic context. He says, okay, there's this probability of what can happen and what, it's not certain, it's not absolute. Then the question then is that who decides what happens? Because we don't see the universe being in a probabilistic state. We see actual stuff happening. When we throw a ball, it comes down. Very predictable. The universe is very predictable. But then the theory is saying that no, it's very unpredictable and down at the quantum level. But then the question is, okay, if it's very unpredictable, then why do we have this predictable world? And the question then is, who is choosing between all of these unpredictabilities and uncertainties? Who is the will that is choosing what would happen? So he talks about this area of what he terms, and it's been discussed before him by other scholars in this book, of the quantum divine action. So basically how the will of God functions at that fundamental level, and how that is what colors our world as we see it. But then obviously he takes you through how the early scholars, the theologians, saw this idea. How did they develop it? Their theories. So it's those theories are called. that whole study is called Kalam. So Islamic theology. All of that. He takes all of those arguments and applies it to the modern scientific arguments. And mashallah, they fit brilliantly. And this is one of, I would say, pioneering research in this field. These two scientists, alhamdulillah, mashallah.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's really fascinating, and I sit here and I think about the technology that we're using, just the internet, our laptops, and being able to have this live and be able to speak with you. And when you're in another country, and here I am. So when we do things, the World Hijab Day, we have to connect with people all over the world, and it's amazing that we're able to do that. And some of that goes back to Muslims. So it's always nice to see that. And we don't always get educated about that in our schools. I know in like North America, you don't even get much exposure to Islam, let alone Muslim scientists. So what about future prospects? What does the future hold for Muslims in science? Can we regain our past glory of being leaders in science and innovation?
Absolutely. I would say, the research that I shared with you, this is just one, just two scientists and their works. But there's a lot that's happening, and mashallah, if you see the statistics throughout the Muslim world, places like North Africa and Central Asia, Turkey, Pakistan, Iran, all of these countries, the scientific research that is happening in these places is just amazing. It's mashallah. It's we I would say within a decade or two, I don't think so there would be much difference between the scientific research that's happening in the US or maybe the UK or Western Europe and these countries, because firstly, thanks to technology and thanks to this exchange of information, that has really facilitated it. And from the Islamic perspective, I guess it's more to do with our overall worldview that Muslims are drawn towards science naturally, not only because it's the culture of the day, but also because they don't find themselves being held up by their religious beliefs or by the culture that has come out of those religious beliefs. They don't find themselves being held up by them. So they have nothing whatsoever holding them back from developing this. And especially, I think, the kind of research that is happening, especially in Iran, medical research, because we have, arguments from the past regarding the ethics, the bioethics, the ethics of medical science. And I think centuries of debates of what is ethical in medical science and what is not. So the foundation has already been built. So what contemporary scientists are doing when they, for example, go ahead with something as novel, as contemporary, as groundbreaking as stem cell research. Now, Iran is almost, you could call it the Muslim capital of the stem cell research. And these are basically you can, in simple words, if you want to grow organs, like literally organs, you can utilize these cells and you can use this culture from these cells in order to grow tissues. And basically this is just groundbreaking research that is happening in the Muslim world right now. And I think what facilitates it is the worldview that Islam has given us, even for the secular scientists. Like, obviously, many of the scientists who conduct research are not really religious people, and that's where, for example, in my organization, we talk about how we can revive that culture of being as religious as possible and as scientific and intellectual as possible, just the way our predecessors were, just the way previous Muslims were. And we still have a long way to go ahead when it comes to that. But then, alhamdulillah, if you ask me, I see the signs of that from the Muslim world, and it's very heartwarming to see that much of the research that is done in the Muslim world also comes along with the ethics of Islam. So, for example, medical science in Islam is complete philanthropy. It's another branch of religious studies. So you don't find the same onslaught of corporations, corporate research, hiding all the patents and not, basically all the benefits go to the corporation and nothing to the citizens, nothing to the common people. You don't find, alhamdulillah, that road being taken in the scientific research that is being developed in the Muslim world. So that's, mashallah, that's where you could call that's Islam playing in. That's the ethics of Islam playing in. That's the ethics of Hadith and the Quran playing in. And they're basically helping the proliferation and the development of science in the Muslim world.
Excellent. I think you did so well with incorporating Islam and the science together. And I know that this session has brought to light a lot for me, and I learned a lot, and I love learning more about this. And because I didn't know, my expertise is not in STEM whatsoever. in school I did finance science, but you know, it's always nice to learn something new about people and how they took these ideas and just continue to grow and go with them, you know, and look at them. And so I hope that the audience learned something new as well. As we wrap up, is there anything else that you wanted to add or share?
Yes, I think there's one thing that I wanted to share. Many people, they don't know is the participation of women. So women were integral to this entire intellectual revolution, which many people are not aware of. Actually, if you ask me, if you make this contrast between the participation of women when it comes to the European scientific revolution, and you make a contrast between how women participated in the Islamic intellectual revolution, there's a sharp contrast. You can see that women are everywhere, women are learning, women are teaching, women are developing science, women are developing mathematics. I mean, people like Sudeta Mohammadi come up, people like Maryam al-Astrolabi come up. These are people like, they're on the front lines developing scientific research. There's so many people, and historians of science talk about how women were integral to, firstly, the religious sciences, the codification of the religious sciences. That became the foundation on which the intellectual sciences of theology and physical sciences like chemistry and physics and astronomy were built. So you find the participation of women throughout the spectrum, and which is very important to note, and which is very important to understand that if women today, they're taking, and we do see an increased participation of Muslim women, especially in the STEM fields. This is not something which is new, which is sort of imported from any other culture, but this is something we're just being true to our own roots, that learning of all sorts was the character of a Muslim. And there wasn't this distinction, this sharp segregation between what is secular and what is religious. Secular was very harmoniously merged with the religious sciences. So yeah, that's one last thing.
I'm glad you brought up the involvement of women, because I think it's so important. We see today that sometimes women's education is still being taken away, and I think that kind of shows the importance of women throughout history and the way that we need women in STEM today. So it's unfortunately that we have to constantly talk about that and bring that up, so to kind of remind people, hey, women also need to be able to go to school and learn these things because they can contribute as well. I think that should be something that we don't have to remind people, but unfortunately we do sometimes. But I really appreciate you joining me today. It was you were very well spoken, and I think people have a chance to learn a lot. And I definitely, I want to wish you the best in all of your future endeavors, because hopefully, in the future down the road, someone is bringing up your name at a conference and saying, oh, I learned so much from her. But thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure. It's an honor to be part of this. And you guys are doing amazing work. And may Allah bless you in your efforts and reward you highly. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience, everyone who watched or will be watching. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.